Do you ever feel like you're stuck in one long, aimless commute, moving without meaning, forgetting who's leading you? In Numbers chapter 33, we see how unfocused motion becomes spiritual drift. We'll retrace how Israel's journey lists from Egypt to the Plains of Moab, and how memory, direction, and boundary forming shape a pilgrim people. And I'll give you one immediate action to turn your wandering into intentional pilgrimage. Listen closely in this episode of Biblical Unlocks. This show is designed to help build your habit of reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, and applying it in your daily life. If you enjoy episodes like this, please consider following and rating the show. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get a little bit of context into Numbers chapter 33. Alright, so Numbers chapter 33 records a liturgical itinerary. It's a carefully ordered list of Israel's encampments from the Exodus out of Egypt through the wilderness to the Jordan's edge. The chapter then turns to commands about entering and dispossessing the land, and it functions as both a travel log and a theological memory. God has guided his people step by step, and now covenant possession, boundaries, and holy ordering must follow. And this is what we're going to be reading in this episode of Biblical Unlocks. So, I'm going to read the first 1 to 15 verses. This is going to focus on departure and early encampments. And the engagement question for this section is, why record the first steps out of Egypt? What do the beginnings tell us? Okay, so let's read verses 1 to 15. These are the stages by which the Israelites went out of the land of Egypt in military formation under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Moses wrote down their starting point stage by command of the Lord, and these are their stages according to their starting places. They set out for Ramses in the first month. On the 15th day of the first month, on the day after the Passover, the Israelites went out boldly in the sight of all the Egyptians. While the Egyptians were still burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck down among them, the Lord executed judgments even against their gods. So the Israelites set out from Ramesses and camped at Succoth. They set out from Succoth and camped at Etham, which is on the edge of the wilderness. They set out from Etham and turned back to Pi-hahiroth, which faces Baal-zephon, and they camped before Migdol. They set out from Pi-hahiroth, passed through the sea into the wilderness, spent a 3 days journey in the wilderness of Etham, and camped at Marah. They set out from Marah and came to Elim. At Elim there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there. They set out from Elim and camped by the Red Sea. They set out from the Red Sea and camped in the wilderness of Sin. They set out from the wilderness of Sin and camped in Dophkah. They set out from Dophkah and camped at Alush. They set out from Alush and camped at Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink. They set out from Rephidim and camped in the wilderness of Sinai. Alright, Biblical Unlock number 1. Just want to point out something because I found it quite interesting. Moses here, he's going through every single one of the stages from Israel's journey out of Egypt. And all of these have biblical cross-references back to the Exodus story. So, Exodus chapter 12 verse 37, Exodus chapter 12 verse 12, how they set out from Ramses, Exodus chapter 13 verse 20, so the Israelites set out from Ramses and camped at Succoth. That's mentioned in Exodus chapter 13 verse 20. They set out from Succoth and camped at Etham, which is on the edge of the wilderness. That's in Exodus chapter 14 verse 2 and verse 9. They set out from Etham and turned back to Pi-hahiroth, which faces Baal-zephon, and they camped before Migdol. That's in Exodus chapter 14 verse 22. So there's a lot of information here which actually lists the departure and early encampments of the Israelites out of Egypt. Now, the question here is, why do we even need to list out the initial steps out of Egypt? The record itself turns escape into a remembered story. The beginnings matter because they mark the act of divine deliverance and set the rhythm for identity. Freedom begins with God's initiative, not human drift. It starts with God. Okay, now we're going to read verses 16 to 49. This is going to be the section on the wilderness stages and stops. My question for you to stay engaged is, what do repeated stops reveal about God's pacing and his providence? So, verse 16, let's read. They set out from the wilderness of Sinai and camped at Kibroth Hattaavah. They set out from Kibroth Hattaavah and camped at Hazeroth. They set out from Hazeroth and camped at Rithmah. They set out from Rithmah and camped at Rimmon Perez. They set out from Rimmon Perez and camped at Libnah. They set out from Libnah and camped at Rissah. They set out from Rissah and camped at Kehelethah. They set out from Kehelethah and camped at Mount Shepher. They set out from Mount Shepher and camped at Haradah. They set out from Haradah and camped at Makheloth. They set out from Makheloth and camped at Tahath. They set out from Tahath and camped at Terah. They set out from Terah and camped at Mithkah. They set out from Mithkah and camped at Hashmanah. They set out from Hashmanah and camped at Moseroth. They set out from Moseroth and camped at Bin Jakan. They set out from Bin Jakan and camped at Hor Haggidgad. They set out from Hor Haggidgad and camped at Jotbathah. They set out from Jotbathah and camped at Abranah. They set out from Abranah and camped at Ezion-Geber. They set out from Ezion-Geber and camped in the wilderness of Zin, that is Kadesh. They set out from Kadesh and camped at Mount Hor on the edge of the land of Edom. Aaron the priest went up Mount Hor at the command of the Lord, and died there in the 40th year after the Israelites had come out of the land of Egypt, on the first day of the 5th month. Aaron was 123 years old when he died at Mount Hor. The Canaanite, the king of Arad, who lived in the Negeb, in the land of Canaan, heard of the coming of the Israelites. They set out from Mount Hor and camped at Zalmunna. They set out from Zalmunna and camped at Punon. They set out from Punon and camped at Oboth. They set out from Oboth and camped at Abarim, in the territory of Moab. They set out from Laim and camped at Dibon-Gad. They set out from Dibon-Gad and camped at Almon-Diblathaim. They set out from Almon-Diblathaim and camped in the mountains of Abarim, before Nebo. They set out from the mountains of Abarim and camped in the plains of Moab by the Jordan, opposite Jericho. They camped by the Jordan from Beth Jeshimoth as far as Abel Shittim, in the plains of Moab. Alright, biblical unlock number 3. Why so many stops? Does God change his mind? No, the stops actually show patient guidance, not aimless wandering. Each camp is a teaching moment. God times formation, provides for needs, and tests faith, and he scaffolds dependence. The itinerary that we see here, all the way from Exodus through Leviticus till Numbers, is the same. That there is an itinerary discipline memory. Remembering each stage prevents forgetful entitlement, feeling entitled that God should provide exactly what you need right now, in the way that you want it, in the way that you see fit. Okay, let's read the final part of the chapter, verses 50 to 56. The focus here is going to be commands about dispossessing the land. Question: how does divine command to drive out inhabitants relate to covenant faithfulness? Let's take a look. Verse 50. In the plains of Moab by the Jordan, opposite Jericho, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the Israelites and say to them, When you cross over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, destroy all their figured stones, destroy all their cast images, and demolish all their high places. You shall take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have given you the land to possess. You shall apportion the land by lot according to your clans. To a large one you shall give a large inheritance, and to a small one you shall give a small inheritance. The inheritance shall belong to the person on whom the lot falls. According to your ancestral tribes you shall apportion it. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those whom you let remain shall be as barbs in your eye and thorns in your sides. They shall trouble you in the land where you are settling, and I will do to you as I thought to do to them. Alright, biblical unlock number 3. Is the command to drive out the Canaanites just conquest talk, or is it actually covenant protection? The answer to this question is that the law frames dispossession as safeguarding covenant faithfulness, removing corrupting influences that threaten Israel's spiritual life. The theological emphasis here is on preserving holiness for the community's future life in the land. Now, many people claim that, or many critics of the Bible claim that the God of the Bible is actually commanding genocide in this particular case. He's saying you need to dispossess the land, you need to demolish all their high places, and so on and so forth. But the important thing to remember, especially with the so-called genocide at Canaan, is the people who were in the land were extremely wicked in their practices, and God did not want them to influence Israel. I recently read a book called How Not to Read the Bible by Dan Kimball, and the book actually it tries to make sense of passages in the Bible which are so-called anti-women, anti-science, pro-violence, pro-slavery, and other crazy-sounding parts of Scripture. And it's important to recognize, and he talks about the violence, so-called violence in the Bible, by making note of this particular fact. He writes, "We also need to look closely at the people whom God was sending Israel to utterly destroy. While we cannot stereotype or judge every citizen of the land of Canaan, a people group Israel was sent to battle against, we can look at some of the religious practices their leadership promoted and allowed in that culture. The Canaanites were involved in some evil worship practices. They had several gods, among whom one was named Moloch. Here's how the worship of Moloch has been described. Moloch was a Canaanite underworld deity, represented as an upright bull-headed idol with a human body in whose belly a fire was stoked and in whose arms a child was placed to be burnt to death. It was not just unwanted children who were sacrificed. Plutarch, a Greek writer and philosopher from the 1st century, reported that during Phoenician Canaanite sacrifices, the whole area before the statue was filled with loud noise of flutes and drums so that the cries and wailing should not reach the ears of people." The point is, the people who were being dispossessed were evil within their own right, engaging in child sacrifice, and God did not want Israel to be accustomed to them or like them in any way. Okay, let's see how this chapter, Numbers chapter 33, finds its fulfillment in Jesus Christ. So, Numbers 33 gives us a little bit of a pilgrimage map. It finds its ultimate Christian fulfillment in Christ in this way. Jesus gathers a people on a journey towards the promised consummation. The itinerary has the following list of items: deliverance, paced guidance, and boundary making. And all of these themes reappear in the gospel as deliverance from slavery, patient sanctification by the Spirit, and the call to put away practices that sabotage discipleship. The pilgrim life is not aimless drift, but it's formed motion under Christ's leadership. As we read in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, "Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul." There is a spiritual war that is going on, and persistence throughout the path is what will get us to the final reward. When we hear Jesus say, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler of many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord." Alright, some practical applications now we can apply. We can reflect, right? We reflected in the same way, or we can reflect in the same way that Moses reflected upon his timeline. So I think it's important for us to do the same thing. Make a quick timeline of our encampments in our life, whether it's our school, our job, our move. And for each of these movements, each of these encampments, you can write out one thing that God has taught you there, one habit that you can keep to remember the lessons. Journaling is a good way to do this, but it's important to reflect and remember that which has happened to you so that you aren't ungrateful. You are not entitled, but rather you are in gratitude for what God has done in your life. Second thing, boundary check. You need to identify recurring temptations or influences that need driving out. Whether you need a habit, an app, friendship pattern, you need to replace it this week with a formative practice, whether it be daily prayer, accountability, a check-in, or a Sabbath routine that strengthens covenantal living. Okay, what are the key takeaways from this episode? Numbers chapter 33, it is a liturgical travel log. God's guidance is intentional, step by step, and it's meant to be remembered. And the list stops, trains, and it allows us to remember communal memory so that deliverance becomes a part of our identity. It's not just something nostalgic in the past. And pacing matters because God's timing is different from our timing, and it forms dependence on God, trust, and spiritual maturity. Practically, the chapter calls us to remember our journeys, practice disciplined boundaries, and let pilgrimage shape our habits. In the next episode, we're going to move from journey to land allotment in Numbers chapter 34, and we're going to unpack how God actually divides the land, how inheritance shapes identity, and what possession means for a pilgrim people. You don't want to miss it. So, if you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to rate the show and follow. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Otherwise, just have a blessed day. And remember, if you're not in your word, you're in your feelings. Godspeed.